Today's presentation is about how color interacts with each other. And today we're really thinking about the ways that color can change based on the colors that surround it. Or, the perception can change. They can look lighter, they can look darker, they can look redder, they can look more blue, right? All of this really has influence based on its surroundings. So we're really going to get into that. And the first theory within all of this I want to talk about is called simultaneous contrast. And simultaneous contrast is the theory that one color can change another color. So it can change how we're perceiving the tone, which you'll remember is another word for value. So it can make something feel brighter or darker. And it can also change the hue itself. So it'll make something seem more red or more orange when they're placed side by side. So here's our first example of this at play. And you can see that we've got blue stripes and yellow stripes. And this red is actually the same exact red as this one. This green is the same exact green as this one. But due to the background that they're placed on, the fact that this is on a yellow background and the fact that this is on a blue background, they look like different colors entirely, right? So this definitely plays into the thought that color is a product of light. It's not really a product of it's not something innate. It's not something unchangeable. It's very much influenced by light and by other color, which is influenced by light. So let's try to figure out what are the rules of this? How can we predict how color bears an influence? That way, whenever we're designing things, we can sort of keep that in mind when we're choosing designs and knowing that things might shift and change. So which of these reds, temperature-wise, looks warmer? And I think we can all agree that this middle one. And which of the greens look cooler? And I think we can all agree that this one looks cooler. So this phenomenon might already be on your radar if you've ever tried to paint walls of your house, right? And so if you come and you get the swatch and you go home and you paint your swatch, the sun might be hitting it in a certain way. And then as the sun goes down, it's a completely different color, right? But then you start to move your furniture in, you start to move your art in, and it also looks like it's a completely different color, right? So you might already be familiar with the real world way that this plays out. But we'll go ahead and get into what are the specific rules of all of this. And so here are two rules. The warm colors are going to look warmer when they're placed next to cool colors. And the cool colors are going to look even cooler when they're placed next to warm colors. So the cool colors are going to be even cooler when they're on top of this yellow warm color. So the yellow is warmer than the green, and it's going to bring out the coolness of the green. So this red looks warmer when it's on top of the blue, right? Because the blue is so cool that it brings out that contrast. That is the word contrast. So the contrast gets amped up with these opposites. And also, the contrast of sameness will start to cancel each other out. And we'll talk about that soon as well. Okay, so here's another example of simultaneous contrast at play. You've got these gray squares, and they're absolutely the same gray. But, which one looks darker, which looks like it's a darker gray, and which one looks like it's a brighter gray? So you can kind of take a moment, and I'm actually gonna pause because I've got like some physical examples that I usually show the class, and it doesn't even translate as well digitally. I'm sure, you know, you are able to like subtly determine, but let me get my physical ones. Okay, so on second thought, that doesn't translate on the webcam also, but I'll try to find some really good lighting whenever I'm explaining y'all's projects, and I'll use the like hand done paper representations of all this stuff. But actually, so when I went to the next slide, it was smaller, and I think you can actually see it a lot better in that way. So you can see that against the gray background, so these middle squares, again, they're the same exact gray, but you can notice that the one on the left is actually brighter. And this is because of those opposites being really accentuated and enunciated. So because this is so dark, it makes the brightness of this gray come out. And because this is so light, it makes more of the darkness come out. So again, same gray, but it's really changing how we perceive it, and it's being influenced by its surroundings. And I actually just had a flash of insight of why this isn't so drastic. It's because the squares in the middle themselves are actually a lot bigger, so they're less influenced by their surroundings than if you have something that's like much smaller than its surroundings. It's more, I guess I'll use the word like vulnerable to that influence. Okay, so we're still talking about value, and just a recap of all the qualities of a color that are possible are hue, value, and saturation. So we're still kind of dealing with the value category right now, but you can look at these. Again, it's the same exact pink, and you can see that now we're adding that hue layer. Like before, we were just working in black and white without hue. And now we're adding that hue layer, and you can see that it gets brighter when it's against the dark background. It gets a little bit darker when it's against the bright background. So again, that's that simultaneous contrast at play. And we can also say the same thing with saturation. So looking at these backgrounds, which one is more saturated than the next? And that's a really easy question because this one has no saturation at all. It's gray. And this one is pretty saturated. It's like a mustard. So this square versus this square, same exact color, but which one is more saturated? And it's going to be the one against the gray background. And this one's going to be less saturated. So saturated color next to a muted color makes the saturated one look less saturated, and the saturated one more saturated. And it's the thing about this class is we do a lot of studies, and we work with like a lot of basic elements like squares, rectangles, swatches. So we really sort of understand this at the most basic level. But what we're working towards always is how to apply this in our designs and how to make our designs better. And so here's an example of simultaneous contrast really working in a design's favor, right? So maybe take a second and try to figure out, based on what we just talked about, why that is. Okay, so we have a really desaturated background, but the artist really wanted these flowers to pop, right? So that is simultaneous contrast at play. This really like brings out the flowers. So if you sort of in your mind's eye can look at this and choose a different background color, and you can choose like a bright blue or just something like fully saturated, you'll notice that the background actually pops instead, because I mean this is a pretty desaturated pink, right? But the fact that we've got also this color bearing its influence, we perceive this as like more prominent, right? It starts to pop more. So that was either, you know, an intuitive or like an analytical design decision, but it's all rooted in that principle of simultaneous contrast and how to create designs based on it. Okay, so here are yet even more examples. And so there are certain things in this piece that seem to glow, and they seem to really, you know, have like light emanating from them. And when we're working with, you know, pigments or paint or even pixels, a lot of that's like illusion, and a lot of that has to do with our choices that we make. So you can see that having the sky be like very, very dark instead of like, you know, blue or light purple or even a dark purple makes this alien start to glow. Same with the hair. You know, you've got this bright blue against a darker background to sort of give that blue such a pop and brightness. Just having the background be darker makes these appear lighter. That's just simultaneous contrast at play. And so this is Joseph Albers. So if you ever think that, you know, our homework is a little bit, I don't know, tedious or not exciting or just boring, just know that there's an artist who devoted his whole career just to studies, and that's actually where we draw a lot of color theory, because day in and day out, his work as an artist was to create pieces that look very similar to this. They're really just involve squares and swatches, but I mean, they are really beautiful in terms of their color combinations. And that's just kind of what he became a master of realizing what colors work together, in what proportions, which one should be bigger, and why. And so he wrote, you know, a lot of books based on, essentially it was research. But yeah, that's how we have a lot of knowledge of color theory also, is through Joseph Albers and all the work that he did as well. Okay, so subtraction. This is the theory that a strong or dominant color will subtract its hue. So just now we talked about value and we talked about saturation, but right now we're going to talk about hue. And so there are hues that are more strong or dominant than the next. And like, you know, red is a really, really powerful hue. Sometimes yellow can be a really powerful hue. You know, purple is probably less dominant than those, right? And that has a lot to do literally with the wavelength of the color. But, you know, it has to do with saturation too. So, you know, a very saturated purple will be more dominant than a desaturated yellow. And so the idea again is that a strong or dominant color will subtract its hue from a smaller or less dominant color. And I can't wait to show you all like my paper versions of it, because it's pretty profound. Okay, so you can see that the X that meets right here and just keeps going. So again, this is Joseph Albers. Remember I was just talking about him and how he devoted his whole life to color, basically. But you can see right here that these colors are the same, but once you sort of immerse yourself in the visual field of each one, they look quite different, right? And that is subtraction at play. So I've got this dominant hue and it almost sucks itself out of this purple. So you can look right here sort of in the middle and you can see that this purple has a lot of this in it, this bottom blue, and it has a lot of this top red as well. So it just sort of against the background like sucks itself out of this X, and the same thing is happening down here. And so it's kind of amazing because this X starts to look a lot like this top rectangle, right? And this top X starts to look a lot like this bottom rectangle. And that's what I'm talking about with this guy who spent like his whole life figuring out which colors can like do this sort of thing together, can sort of suck it themselves out. Okay. So compare these two squares in the center and tell me what you think is going on. Okay, so my hint here that, you know, the value and the saturation is probably being affected. Oh, I should also say these three squares and these three squares are the exact same. Yeah. Not the top two, but the middle one. That middle square right here and here. So it's basically sucking the color out of it, right? A pure red will suck out its red from this orange and give you a yellow. The pure yellow will suck out the yellow and give you more of like a golden, more reddish orange. And just two terms that could be helpful for you. The mass tone is the main hue and overtone is the second hue. So you might be used to that if you took some painting classes. But the mass tone would be this like reddish purple back here, and the overtone is this more blue X. So you can see that this back pink, there's two things happening, right? We've got subtraction happening for sure. So we've got the pink that is sucking itself out of the pig, and it's becoming less pink. Whereas this pig against this background is the pink sort of being retained in there visually. So yeah, that's happening, but also simultaneous contrast is happening. So if you look at the pigs, you can see one is definitely more saturated than the other. And you can see that that's the case here, right? It's more saturated because it's against a desaturated background, and vice versa. So that's why things really seem to pop against gray. And you can already just see, like, especially because this is a shape, like how this can apply for designs, right? You don't want to make your background of your poster crazy loud unless your elements can really hold water to it. Unless you have like, maybe this is more of a border than a background. It's really hard visually to compete with something that's so saturated, because it really does like literally drain the color out of other things. It drains itself and it drains the saturation as well. Okay. So this is kind of the reverse thing going on. And this is called turning two colors into one. So this just further illustrates how color can bear its influence on other colors. So you've got two different greens, and you put them on top of their respective backgrounds, and you can see that they look very similar. And so you can imagine this project took a really long time. And this is, I don't know, something we more so do in class whenever we get to use the computer, because hand mixing this is such a trial and error. Being on the computer with this is such a trial and error, because you can imagine you use a different shade of yellow, even slightly, it won't subtract just enough value, because that's really what's going on, right? You see these two, they're different values. And so we're really trying to like subtract enough of this value to make them look similar. And even still, like, it's not quite perfect, right? This still looks a little bit darker. But you can imagine through a lot of experimentation and a lot of trial and error, you can get a background color that will, you know, suck out just enough saturation or just enough value to make these look the exact same. And so that's kind of the work of Illustrator, right? That sort of helps us, instead of like hand mixing until we get it right. But it's a hard one to do. Okay, so as a pop quiz, which of these two grounds will make the chromatic gray more saturated? Oh, I tell you the answer. A, right? That's pretty easy. It's a desaturated background. It's already a pretty desaturated color as is, so we would go with A. Which of these two grounds will make the green appear darker in value? So we think about contrast. And so we're going to pick the lighter of the two, which is A. That's going to make the green look darker. Which is going to make this chromatic gray, which is already a little bit orange, appear more orange. Subtraction's also always a little bit tricky for my brain. I have to really, really stop and think about it. But so if you remember from the very last lecture I sent you, it was about how if two things are sort of opposite of each other on the color wheel, you can start to combine them and start to get closer and closer to gray, which is what's happening here. Like, if you take A and B and you start to combine them, it's not a perfect gray, right? I think that's because this is not a perfect color wheel, but they're using the red, blue, and yellow color wheel right now. So this is kind of the version of gray that they would get from that. So if I put this gray on top of this blue, it's going to subtract itself out of it. It's going to take the blue out of it, and we're going to be left with orange, right? Because this is a combination of A and B. With B, if we put this on here, what do you think we'll get more of? It'll start to look more blue, basically. Okay, and so this is kind of a whole new concept. We're jumping away from simultaneous contrast and subtraction. And so subtraction is kind of part of simultaneous contrast, but we're now talking about a different theory, and it's still very much in the realm of color interactions and color influence, but it's called contrast of extension. And using contrast of extension, you think about proportions and bringing things into balance. And the easiest way I can sum this up is to say that, you know, some colors are just inherently more intense. Yellow is inherently more intense than purple. So for things to feel like they're harmonious and balanced, there's kind of a sweet spot that involves less of some and more of another, and it just kind of balances it out like that. So, you know, we could get way more into that, but that's kind of an overview. Transparency in space. So again, whenever we're working with 2D compositions, whether they be pixel, whether they be paints, or what have you, we're always giving the illusion of space because it's 2D, right? It's a flat surface. Even if it's a screen, it's 2D. So we're giving the illusion that there's depth and that even transparency. And we do that through colors. Let me see. Yeah, I don't really have word explanation, but I'll definitely explain it with my words. Okay, so with space, as things go back in space, they get more transparent, they get lighter, and they get less saturated. So what I wish I had in this slide, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, is a mountain, like a picture of mountains as they recede in space. And we've all seen that. So, you know, that's definitely in all of our cultural memory to like have a scene of mountains that sort of recede in space. And the mountains that are closest to you are going to be darker. You're going to be able to see detail on them. They're going to be more saturated. And as they fall back into that misty scene, they get lighter and more desaturated. And so if you were to draw a mountain scene, that's sort of the illusion that you would be creating, is having these sort of get lighter and desaturated back in space. In terms of transparency, that's also an illusion that you create with darkness and desaturation. So for example, this square right here looks like it's a transparency over these 4 squares. But the fact of the matter, it's not. It's paint, and now it's pixels. And the way that they give this illusion is they sort of experimented with color. And Joseph Albers, of course, has a whole body of work just about transparency and spatial illusion. I think this might be a picture from one of his books. But you sort of experiment. And so right there, you've got sort of like a blue, and you've got sort of a purple, and you've got sort of a blue yellow. And all of these look like they could be the same sheet of like blue transparency, how they would interact with the squares below, the shapes below. And this color here is really just desaturated, and it's dark, and it's a blue mixed with these colors that are underneath it. And it just looks like a piece of transparency on top, but it's not. It's a color, it's paint, it's pigment. Same with this one. And they sort of like played with the level of transparency, right? So this color purple, not transparent at all. It does not look like there's a sheet laying on top of it. This one, you start to darken the purple and it gets more transparent. Or yeah, I'm sorry, darken it and desaturate it. And you keep going, and that desaturation is more and more intense until it looks like this yellow thing is sitting more and more on top of it, getting more and more like opaque, right? Okay, I want to talk about Mark Rothko. He's the next guy who spent his whole life dealing with color. And so he has these paintings, and they're massive. They're bigger than human beings. And they're just sort of fields of color. And so we've been talking so far about how color bears an influence on other colors, which definitely happens in his piece, right? There's a sort of like a vibrating and a back and forth that happens in his pieces. But also it's important to keep in mind that what color is really doing is also influencing us. We are the witness. We are being affected by it. And so that being said, a lot of his paintings would cause an emotional response in people. There's like a whole book about paintings that make people cry, and his is one of them. He has like a whole chapel of paintings that people go to and sort of get lost in these fields. Apparently it's a very emotional experience for some. Okay, so the last topic we'll talk about before we get into a couple other artists that are obsessed with color and color alone is metamorism. And metamorism has a lot to do with light. So, you know, taking two balls that are the same color, and if you put them under a certain lighting condition, that they'll look very different colors. And this isn't something we really spend too much time playing with, because it has a lot to do with material and the composition of the material. So you could see if, like, you know, this chain is off just a little bit. I'm trying to find where the discrepancy is and how these are different. Oh, it's missing, or these are switched. So even if that's just a little bit different, the light is going to act in a different way. So if we remember the way that color works to begin with, it's light that's being absorbed by molecules, and light has all the wavelengths in it. And so those molecules reflect certain wavelengths, and they either combine or they stand alone, and that's how we get the color. So if we have a different combination, they have different wavelengths. And so that's something to keep in mind when dealing, I guess, with objects themselves, like more sculptural art, but not so much a problem working digitally. Okay, Yves Klein is another person who was obsessed with color, and in particular blue. He made his own blue, and he just kind of like went to town with it, and like this was his art, was just like this blue, and he'd make sculptures out of it. And like this looks like I guess it's supposed to look like a swimming pool, but it just looks like a huge like fake lawn basically to me. And then again, Joseph Albers, who kind of been harping on a little bit. Just made a lot of, famous works, but they're just exploring color. Like, what does color do to itself, and what does it do to me? Were like his main questions. Okay, so I guess I'll just read this. Most artists understand that color theory plays a very important role in their work, yet it's really essential to go beyond the color wheel, beyond all of these theories, and that's where simultaneous contrast comes in. So remember that color casts a shadow tinted with its complement. So for a cohesive look to the palette, you'll want to have colors next to each other that are in the same range of tint warmth. To make a color look lighter, you'll place a dark color next to it, and vice versa. So we'll do a whole project when we're picking a palette, and then we'll apply that palette later. But you think about how adjacent colors affect one another. And to test how they'll look before putting them on a canvas, you paint a small swatch of each on separate cards, and you move them close to and away from each other and see how this changes. That's a good thing to do, but it's also not quite enough, right? Because if we think about contrastive extension, it also matters the amount too. So you might want to do swatches that are bigger than other ones. And it's a quick way to know if you like the effect or if something needs an additional tinting before putting the color on the canvas itself. So that's everything to do with color interactions for now. And we'll do a project based on that and some studies based on that. And so what we're always working for, right, is how to apply this to our bigger designs. So let me know if you have any questions on that, and definitely feel empowered to
look at any of these famous color people that really just spent their whole career on color.